The rain came down in sheets that November night, turning the streets of Manhattan into rivers of despair. Beneath the flickering neon sign of a closed pawn shop, Margaret Chen huddled against the cold brick wall, her tattered coat doing little to shield her from the biting wind. She was 63 years old, though the streets had aged her beyond recognition. Her weathered hands clutched a piece of cardboard she'd fashioned into a makeshift shelter, and her eyes, once bright with dreams, now carried the weight of 1,000 disappointments. Margaret had been invisible for so long that she'd almost forgotten what it felt like to be seen. But tonight, in the darkest hour of her life, she would become the most important person in the world to a man she'd never met. Across the city, in a penthouse that touched the clouds, Richard Thornton sat alone at his desk, staring at a bottle of pills. He was 47, worth $8 billion, and completely hollow inside. The empire he'd built, the tech companies, the real estate, the charitable foundations that bore his name, all of it felt meaningless now. His wife had left him 3 years ago, taking their daughter to California. His father had just passed away, and the weight of pretending to be happy, to be whole, had finally crushed him. The city that never slept was about to lose one of its brightest stars, and nobody would know until morning. Richard had made his decision. He'd written the letters, arranged everything perfectly. All that remained was to take that final walk. If you believe in the power of human connection, in second chances, and the idea that every life has purpose, please hit that like button, leave a comment about what kindness means to you, share this story with someone who needs hope, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us share more stories that matter. Richard walked through the rain-soaked streets at 2 a.m, his hood pulled low, heading toward the bridge. He'd dismissed his driver hours ago, telling him not to wait. He wanted to be alone for this, to disappear the way he felt inside, quietly, without ceremony. The rain disguised his tears, and he was grateful for that small mercy. He walked past closed storefronts and empty corners, past the life he was leaving behind when he heard it, a sound so faint he almost missed it. A woman's voice, singing. Margaret was singing to keep herself warm, an old lullaby her mother had taught her in Taiwan before they'd immigrated to America 50 years ago. Her voice cracked with cold and hunger, but the melody carried something pure and ancient, something that spoke of love that transcended language. Richard stopped walking. He couldn't say why, but his feet wouldn't move forward. He turned toward the sound and saw her there, a small figure huddled in shadows, singing as if her song could hold back the darkness. For a moment their eyes met. Margaret saw a man soaked to the bone, his expensive clothes doing nothing to hide the devastation in his eyes. She'd seen that look before, in the mirror of store windows, in the faces of others who'd lost their way. Richard saw a woman who had every reason to be bitter, every reason to have given up, yet she was singing. Something shifted in that moment, something neither of them could name. "Are you all right?" Margaret asked, her voice rough but genuine. It was the first time anyone had asked Richard that question in years, really asked, not as a formality but as if the answer mattered. Richard's carefully constructed walls began to crumble. He couldn't speak, couldn't explain why a stranger's concern had broken through when nothing else could. He stood there in the rain, this man who owned buildings and companies and more money than he could spend in 10 lifetimes, and he wept. Not the silent tears from before, but great shaking sobs that came from somewhere deep inside where he'd locked away his humanity. Margaret did something then that would change both their lives forever. She stood up, her old bones protesting, and she walked to him. Without a word, she took off her coat, that thin, worn coat that was all she had against the cold, and she placed it around his shoulders. It was absurd, really. She had nothing, and he had everything, yet she gave him her coat. More than that, she gave him her presence. She stood with him in the rain, and she waited, the way someone waits for a storm to pass, patient and sure. "I was a nurse once," Margaret said softly, her hand steady on his shoulder. 30 years at County Hospital. I lost my job when I got sick, lost my apartment, lost everything. But I learned something in all those years caring for people. I learned that nobody is beyond saving. Not if they have one person who sees them, really sees them. Richard looked at this woman who should have been bitter, who should have turned away from his wealthy man's pain, but instead she stood with him like a lighthouse in the storm. "I was going to," he started but couldn't finish. "I know," Margaret said. "I've been there too. Last winter I almost gave up. But then a little girl gave me her sandwich, and her mother smiled at me like I was human. That was enough to get me through one more day. And then another. And then another. That's all we need sometimes, just enough kindness to get us through one more day." They stood together for a long time, this unlikely pair bound by the universal language of suffering and survival. Richard couldn't explain what happened to him in those moments, but the fog that had surrounded his mind began to lift. He saw clearly for the first time in months, saw that his pain, his loss, his despair were real, but they weren't the whole story. Margaret had lost everything too, yet she was here, singing in the rain, offering her coat to a stranger. "What's your name?" Richard finally asked. "Margaret Chen." "And you?" "Richard, just Richard." He couldn't remember the last time he'd introduced himself without his title, without the armor of his accomplishments. "Well, just Richard, I think we both need to get out of this rain. There's a diner 3 blocks from here. They know me, sometimes give me coffee. Let me buy you a cup." She smiled at the impossibility of it. This homeless woman offering to buy coffee for a man who could buy the entire chain. Richard smiled too, his first genuine smile in months. "I'd like that, but let me buy, please." If this story has touched your heart in any way, if you've ever felt invisible or been saved by a stranger's kindness, please take a moment to like this video and leave a comment. Tell us about a time someone showed you unexpected kindness, or share this story with someone who needs to hear it today. They walked to the diner together, and over bitter coffee and a shared plate of eggs, they talked until dawn. Richard learned about Margaret's life, her years as a nurse, her daughter who died of cancer, the medical bills and illness that had stolen her stability. Margaret learned about Richard's empire of success built on a foundation of loneliness, about the daughter he missed desperately, about the father whose approval he'd never quite earned. They were both surprised to discover that wealth and poverty were just different costumes for the same human struggles. As the sun rose over the city, painting the wet streets gold, Richard made a phone call. Within hours, Margaret had a warm apartment, a full refrigerator, and a job, not out of charity, but recognition of her value. Richard established a foundation dedicated to helping people like Margaret, not just with money, but with dignity and purpose. But more importantly, they became friends. True friends who met every Tuesday for coffee, who reminded each other that being seen, being valued, being human, that was the real wealth. Margaret had saved Richard's life that night beneath the pawn shop sign, not just from the bridge he'd been walking toward, but from the isolation that had been killing him slowly. And Richard had saved her too, not just from the streets, but by proving that her life still mattered, that her song in the darkness could change the world. Before we end, if this story reminded you that every life has value, that kindness creates ripples we can't imagine, please comment hope below. Let's flood the comments with hope and show the world what this community believes in. Years later, at the opening of the Margaret Chen Center for Second Chances, Richard would tell this story to a room full of people. He'd talk about the homeless woman who saved a billionaire's life, and how she taught him that we save each other, not with money or power, but with presence, with seeing each other, with the simple, radical act of giving what we have, even when it's only a worn coat and a song in the rain. And in the front row, Margaret would smile, knowing that sometimes the most valuable thing we possess is the ability to stand with someone in their darkest hour and remind them they're not alone. That's what she gave him. That's what they gave each other. That's what we all can give, if we choose to see.